The House Republican Conference is reacting to that leaked audio obtained by the New York Times, which we played you at length last night, in which Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy of California and other Republican leaders criticized members of their own party in the days following the January 6th insurrection. At one point, McCarthy and his second in command, Steve Scalise of Louisiana, who himself, of course, is the victim of a politically motivated attack when he was shot in 2017, singled out Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida for his conduct, which they worried could incite further violence.
I'm calling Gaetz. I'm explaining to him. I don't know what I'm going to say, but I'm going to have some other people call him too. But the nature of if I'm getting briefing, I'm going to get another one from the FBI tomorrow. This is serious shit to cut this out.
Yeah, that's I mean, it's potentially illegal what he's doing.
Well, he's putting people in jeopardy, and he doesn't need to be doing this. We saw what people would do in the Capitol, and these people came prepared with rope, with everything else.
Today, McCarthy addressed those comments in a closed-door meeting with Republicans. He reportedly told the conference the leaked audio was merely a distraction from more politically salient issues for the party, which is sort of predictable. Apparently receiving a standing ovation when he finished, also sort of predictable. But not everyone was pleased. NBC News reports that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia pressed both McCarthy and Scalise to apologize for their comments. Neither man did. And Congressman Gaetz, the subject of the leaked conversation, asked Scalise to state which of his comments he considered illegal. Scalise reportedly refused to provide specifics, but McCarthy tried to remind Gaetz of the real enemy. Quote, McCarthy urged unity and said Republicans should be attacking Democrats. Jackie Alemany is the congressional investigations reporter for the Washington Post, where she covers the fallout from the January 6th insurrection. Her latest article is how the January 6th committee is looking into discussions of Trump using the Insurrection Act and martial law. First, let's just start on the sort of caucus dynamics, as best as we can tell from your reporting and others, Jackie, about, what the kind of balance of power in this caucus, which seems to me to be much more weighted towards the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Matt Gaetzes of the world today than it was on, say, January 10th of last year.
Yeah, there is sort of an asymmetric balance here. The loudest voices in the room, Chris, are definitely Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, and they still hold the attention of a really important constituency for all House Republicans, and that's Trump's base. But on the other hand, at this point, these fringe members are being overpowered, and the rest of the House GOP conference are becoming exceedingly frustrated with their antics and some of their behavior. That's why in the closed-door meeting this morning, where House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy received a standing ovation for trying to sweep these comments under the rug and call for unity and for his members to focus on issues like inflation or the border, right. Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene were the only two who really protested. And in the aftermath of that meeting, as we chased down members who were then walking to the Capitol, they didn't want to get into what exactly those two members said, but did sort of roll their eyes at Gaetz and Taylor Greene, asking Steve Scalise to apologize and venting frustrations with what that leaked audio said about them.
Yeah, I mean, what I thought was interesting is I'm going to play some sound from Scalise, who was asked about this. I mean, he sounds apologetic here, right? I mean, there's a little bit of an upside downness here. Like, their concern is people just died. We had a near threat to democracy. We were holed up. What you guys are saying is wrong. And here's Scalise talking today about, like, basically telling Matt Gaetz, like, I'm sorry, kind of. Take a listen.
So I shared that with Matt. I'm sorry that those comments caused him problems because it was things that was conveyed to me from a number of places that we were, and look, you can go back to those days after January 6th. There were a lot of reports floating around. Some turned out to be true, some not. And so, as you're having private conversations commenting on those things, ultimately, the concerns I had were that there were members getting death threats. And that was something that I surely wanted to be vocal at pushing back on, but he and I talked about that.
I'm thinking here of the distinction between what they're doing here and what they're doing with Madison Cawthorn. I mean, Madison Cawthorn, guns are blazing, right? They are out. The knives are out for him. Tom Tillis today was tweeting about his insider trading. And his sin was telling a podcast about coke orgies that he says he's been invited to and that members of Congress are participating in. And it's like, they're loaded for bear on Madison Cawthorn. In some ways, it's like they're showing how they can go after someone if they want to, I guess is my point. And they're not really going to do that with Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz, even if they roll their eyes.
Yeah, Chris, and what we just heard there from Steve Scalise was a half revisionist history. And Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz continue to propagate the same conspiracy theories and double down on a lot of the rhetoric that they were peddling ahead of January 6, 2021. And you know, most recently, just a few months ago on Steve Bannon's podcast, said that they had no shame for any of their actions and their contributions to potentially, you know, the however many people died in the January 6th insurrection, and said that they had, you know, walked through again a lot of their plans and some of the legal avenues that they were exploring. And so, you know, leadership wants to sweep this under the rug for obvious political issues of political expediency, but their members, we should be very clear, continue to believe and disseminate these really dangerous claims.
Quickly, just on your latest reporting in the January 6th committee, you say that they've been looking at discussions about invoking the Insurrection Act or declaring martial law. Of course, that's what Marjorie Taylor Greene said members were urging in that text, using presidential powers to justify seizing assets of voting machine companies, using the military to require a rerun of the election. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think what is important about these leaks that we saw this week from the January 6th committee about Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that a lot of members were calling for the former president to invoke martial law is the sort of the broader context here. It wasn't just GOP members. This was you know, people, Trump's outside legal team, people who were presenting these actual proposals to the former president in the Oval Office. There were many different players who were throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to get the president to take extraordinary measures to strong-arm his way into overturning the election. And the committee is certainly interested in that and also trying to determine the extent that the former president was actually seriously considering these proposals.
Jackie Alemany, as always, thank you so much.